Oh my gosh, welcome to October, guys. I did not publish on Wednesday because I was saving it because I was so excited. I was getting to finally get a conversation with the incredible Stephanie Izzi from Autism Included, which is their nonprofit, and Access Speech, which is their SLP clinic. Guys, she's on LinkedIn, Facebook, and just joining the gram. So I'll make sure I have those down in the show notes. Stephanie's going to be sharing some things with us today because in October, I want to talk about access to services in late identified life. Like what's available? What might we be interested in? What are some things that might be beneficial or helpful to us in late identified life? Because guys, I have an auditory processing delay. So SLP services, integrated listening systems, all of those things were not brought to my attention. I found them like everything else in my late identified life through my child. So Stephanie's going to be joining us and we're going to talk all things services and how to get started, especially when it comes to speech language things in our life. Stephanie, welcome to the show. I'm so excited you're here.
I'm very excited to be here. Thank you.
Oh my goodness. Okay. So late identified life, mind your autistic brain. This is what we are. This is what we're about. That's why I'm here. We're talking about all the things that are part of our experience in late identified life, be it autistic, ADHD, dyslexic, dyspraxic, all of the ND umbrella, because a lot of times we discover one thing and then it's like layer by layer, we start to identify all of the other components. And one of those things for me was my auditory processing delay. And it was a huge one because I didn't recognize I had been struggling with that. And it would get worse later in the day for me because I'm sort of my peak performances in the morning. And I did not discover the joy of closed captions on television and how it makes, I can't even hear if I don't have closed captions on anymore. So, it's like all of those things that just start to make a difference. So Stephanie, how did autism come into your world? Let's kind of just start with you and your story.
Okay, sure. So I was identified as an adult, or discovered my diagnosis rather as an adult. Since I started working as an SLP after going to grad school, and I knew I was different, and I pushed really hard to actually get an ADHD diagnosis, which I also have. And that was something that I discovered, and I became an SLP. I started working a lot with autistic kids, and I was slow on the realization. I kept saying to myself, oh, I don't think any of these kids are autistic. They're just like me. They can't be autistic. And so after a while of that, it became apparent that I had it backwards and I was just like them because I was also autistic, and discovered that I actually had that diagnosis as a child as well and just didn't realize it wasn't disclosed. And that then I have my own child now who is also autistic. So I learned a lot. Was so happy to find the neurodiversity movement and the community of autistic adults that are great advocates. It was very helpful and enlightening. And it really helped with that cognitive dissonance of the way that we address the needs of autistic children, adults, and everyone in between doesn't fit with the reality of the autistic brain. And so that's kind of been the focus of our nonprofit and our speech therapy supports, and we're bringing in occupational therapy as well, because these things can be extremely helpful and supportive and necessary, but they're so hard to find. And the way that a lot of professionals still approach, the needs of autistic people is kind of the opposite of what they actually need. That can be really challenging to navigate.
It really can. And you know what, I think you speak to like sort of the core of the accessibility issue for us as adults, in that, how our therapists and practitioners are being trained to identify and recognize autism traits and those challenges, as well as those places where we excel. And what that looks like is so narrow and so small, and it does not encompass the community of incredible autistics that present in very different and unique ways. And
Yes.
so I think that is really sort of part of that conversation and shifting so that we do have more access and people don't look at us and go, well, you don't look autistic. You can't
Right.
possibly be autistic. You hold eye contact and you have
Sure.
friends and, all those incredibly like,
Yep.
are you kidding me comments, because it's, and that sort of, goes to, you were trained. And so you showed up in the world
Yes.
going, well, these kids can't possibly be autistic. They're like me. Instead of going, well, hey, there's this beautiful spectrum of how we show up in the world. And this is just me. And these kids are me. So,
And it is.
we
They
go
are.
for
We're so
decades,
alike.
and we go for decades not knowing. So what are some of the things that, as a late identified adult yourself, as a mom, because I'm a mom, and that was sort of, we were both talking about, that's kind of how we came to our own, awareness and identification, but that's also kind of how we started to recognize, oh, that actually would help me too.
Yes.
What are some of those things, especially like from the SLP, the speech language side of things, that would be really helpful? Because like I learned to navigate a lot of stuff and didn't realize it. But then I found all
Right.
these things that were like hugely helpful once I knew to look for them. So what are some of those things,
Yes.
Stephanie?
One, you mentioned auditory processing, and I think that's a huge part of the supports that are really helpful. And the first step is kind of identifying whether or not that is a struggle for you. And it can tie into so many other things like sensory processing and attention and fatigue, and all of those executive functioning pieces that I think kind of go together. So being able to recognize, that interoception kind of idea that, okay, now I know for me, auditory processing is a struggle, especially if there's distractors, especially if it's a highly stressful situation. So, and again, unfortunately, or fortunately, a lot of it's accommodation and not anything that is direct therapy, if that makes sense. There's no like thing to practice. You can get better, but I think the accommodations are hugely important and being able to advocate for those. So you mentioned the closed captioning on TV. That has been a huge game changer for me. I am loving closed captioning.
So I'm actually going to hit our live transcript right now because I forgot
Right.
to when I jumped in here because I'm just like, what is missing? Something is missing. Why can't I hear?
Exactly. And knowing that, I have an autistic spouse also, so navigating relationships when you have, or professional relationships too, I think knowing that about yourself, that hey, if you're talking to me, especially after 4 or 5 p.m. or at this time, or when I'm doing something, I might not be able to process what you're saying. I need extra time to process it. Could you write it down? We do a lot of texting at home. It's been a huge help. I'd much
We
prefer
even
that to a
went,
phone call.
I'm gonna just divulge because I just do
Mhm.
this. So not only do we sometimes, Josh and I, text each other just for like communication stuff, we also will sext each other.
Exactly. We use emojis a lot too, because they were
Oh
just like
yes,
an amazing way
totally.
to share those feelings and like not have to rely so heavily on language. It's a
Okay,
really nice.
meme communication, like, oh my gosh. Okay, so my partner loves to communicate in memes. So we get memes. I get all kinds of crazy memes. You too?
It's beautiful. It's beautiful, and I love it. And knowing that and celebrating that and being able to say like, hey, I might not be able to hang in there for an hour and a half phone call. I can't. Phone calls are not my thing, but I would love to just drop these in, and being mindful of that in friendships and in all these different relationships, that you can still let people know you're thinking about them and share really deep parts of yourself with them through these other avenues. And it really is a nice adaptation.
Oh my gosh, Stephanie, that's huge. I love that. Because, Allie and I in her Brain Connection Lab, that's what we talk about is relationships. And from our perspective, because most everything out there is all about, the guy and the man's perspective. And when we say her brain, we're talking about her, she, they and them. We're talking about monogamous, we're talking about polyamorous, we're talking about queer, non-binary, chromodiverse, all of that, because that's us in this community, especially coming from this side of the table, in a relationship. And that's one of the things that I think, from a societal point of view, like when you have like auditory processing delays, those can influence and impact your relationship if you're not aware of it, or if you're just starting to become aware of it. And it's like, there can be those frustration points where people are interpreting your communication style as being detached, or you're not interested, and, or you don't want to talk to me, you don't want to share your day or whatever. And I'm like, at the end of the day, my ears, I can't take it in. Right. And so, but when you can have that conversation and you're on, and there's a connection there that goes, hey, I want to hear about it like over coffee in the morning, if that works for you.
Yes, the time
right?
of day. And I think trusting that not only about yourself, but about your communication partners is hugely important. Auditory processing is a piece. Also, our use and processing of language. Like there's a variety within the autistic community of how language gets processed. And, you'll hear about some people being really visual and some people being really literal, and or associating different things, both processing and expressing themselves with language can be I don't even want to say it can be a challenge, because we haven't been talking about it openly. And I think with my sister, again, that process of identifying as autistic, for me, I was like, no, we're both just ADHD, and she also has discloses that she has that ADHD diagnosis. But I was like, right, you're the same as I am, right? And so we would look at all of these things, and I realized very quickly, nope, she's not. She does not process things the same way. And once we discovered that, like, our communication got a lot better, because one of the things I talk about with the families that I counsel and people that are discovering that they too have some of these autistic traits is, where in your life do you see communication breakdowns? And it's not that there's anything wrong with you or how you're communicating. When you can say to a communication partner, I want to push through this, here's what I'm trying to say, what are you hearing? Like, it goes both ways. Like, if you have that trust and that safety and that flexibility to come into a conversation, even if I accidentally offend people a lot of the time and didn't realize why, and people would misunderstand what I was saying a lot. I process things quickly, and I make connections that I didn't explain, right? I'm a big picture, then focus on the details kind of thinker. And so understanding that, and when you're not landing, right? When I'm like, that didn't land the way I intended it to land, having that knowledge and self-awareness, not self-awareness, but awareness of communication styles too, to say, hey, let's push through this. I don't think that landed correctly, and vice versa. I'm interpreting what you're saying as this, or your tone is making me think something. Is that accurate? Like, just to be able to clarify that communication repair is what I call it. Like, learning about how, when there are breakdowns in communication, how do you repair that? And it's definitely a two-way street, right? It's you and whoever you're partnering with, and however they think.
Oh, that's a really good one. That Allie and I always talk about those 4 levels of communication that are happening when we're communicating with another person. And it's, what I intend to say, what I actually say, the lens and the filter that the other person is taking that in with, and then their interpretation of that. And there's 4 levels in that for things to go amiss and to not connect, and sometimes to completely explode. And I love this because, Brene Brown uses this term, and it's just become one that I just think really has helped me in my life. And I've shared it, because I think it's so helpful.
Fabulous resource.
Like, I show up and it's like, well, this is kind of what I'm hearing. This is the story I'm telling myself, because it's that internal monologue that's really getting in the way of communication a lot of times. And if we need a little more time to process what somebody says, and there may be a high speed auditory processor, and they're expecting you to have a response right away. And when you don't, then there's a story they're telling themselves about why you don't. there's all this stuff that can go awry. So Stephanie, what would you say, like, from a repair standpoint? Because I love this. I think this is just a great conversation from a repair standpoint. Like, if we're starting to notice, maybe we don't notice, because sometimes we're in our own head thinking about what we're going to say next, or interpreting and processing what someone just said. And for those of us who may, need a little extra processing time, there's that gap in there. And so there's a lot of space to be filled with thought between these two folks having a conversation. What is maybe one of the, one or two tips that you've got, like, okay, kind of, here's some things to look for when maybe communication's going off the rails a little bit, how to bring it back into repair?
Yeah. To be quite honest, for myself as an autistic communicator, I do check-ins with communication partners, and it really will depend on how comfortable you are kind of with this person and disclosing what you want to about yourself. There's no need to disclose anything that you don't want to, but to say, like, hey, I just want to check in and see what you heard. Here's what I'm trying to say, to be really clear. And then with someone you have a relationship with, I think the most important thing is to be constantly open about your communication style. I've told people, when you say something like this, when you come in and it sounds like something is really urgent, it makes me really anxious. So if there's something that isn't really urgent, could you just put it in an email and, feel free to check in. I tell people to remind me about things all the time. I'm like, I forget things. So please don't feel like it's rude to remind me if I'm supposed to be doing something that you don't feel like I've, gotten back to you on. And then if there is a communication breakdown, it really takes two-way trust. It takes trust in that relationship, and you both have to, I always say, like, assume positive intent with a communication partner. No one is, be honest. If you're going in there trying to make someone mad, like, you have to be honest about that. And so does your communication partner, but usually that's not the case. You just have to kind of work through misunderstandings and miscommunication, I think, just in an open and continuous way.
That's such a good one. That was one that, I'm going to be honest, I always assumed that somebody was coming after me. I didn't assume good intent, right? I didn't. I because, hey, rejection sensitivity over here.
Sure.
So, and it's kind of funny because, excuse me, hang on, I got a minute. Got a tickle in my throat. But, that was like, my mom would always say, oh, Carol Jeannie, where you're hard on your sleeve, your feelings get hurt so easily, honey. And I was like, well, that's because the whole world is attacking me. I felt like everybody was out to get me and I was always wrong, right? But I noticed and I learned, over the last few years, the more I learned about me, right? It was like, oh, wow, I actually was going into each conversation already prepared for the worst and expecting the worst. And I already had my defenses up. So I really wasn't listening. I really wasn't
I think
showing up just to be curious and open.
It's so important too to validate that those thoughts come from somewhere. Like, there's constant messaging that autistic people are wrong and doing things wrong, and that's very valid. I don't think it's an easy thing to just say for an autistic person to assume positive intent, but it has been helpful, especially in close relationships where you really do want to put that effort in, and if someone's open to you as well, then it works really, really well. But it does take practice.
Huge.
Yeah.
Well, it does, and it just takes knowing that, oh gosh, I don't have to show up to a conversation like prepared for battle and like protecting myself. Honestly, I mean, seriously, like, hey, I am more literal in my thinking than I recognized for a long time. It's like, I get that I can be a literal thinker, but I've also learned to encompass it and think in the gray, which has been huge because I'm a visual thinker, but I'm also one of those high-speed thinkers. I'm like you.
Yes.
And one of my mentors said to me, we were working on a project together, and he said, Carol Jean, I know that you're like 50 miles ahead of us. You have already solved all the problems and you are up there already going, but the rest of us have to catch up a little bit. We have to have some of those things in between. Can you come just circle back and check on us and leave a Post-it note? That's all I'm asking.
That's a great, I love, leave a post-it note. It's a good little
He was
reminder.
like,
I like
look,
that.
I know you're over the mountain. Like, we can't even see you. You're not even like on the horizon anymore, because you have already solved this problem. And the rest of us are still back here at like step 6, and you're at step 200. Could you just circle back and leave us a post-it note so we know where to find you, or at least how to get to you? And I've always thought about it that way, like in communication
it's so
too.
interesting. It's great. I mean, and that is someone clearly like willing to work and say, hey, this is what I need. What do you need? I think it's also important to just take note of the fact that for a lot of us autistic brains, it can be hard to notice when people don't have good intent. So to be able to check in with yourself and say like, okay, if you do feel uncomfortable in a situation, it's great to assume positive intent, but it's also important to check in, especially if you don't have that good relationship or that trust with someone, to check in and say, okay, is there something about this that doesn't sit right with me, and why? And if you got, sometimes, you know, I tend to have that black and white thinking and knee-jerk reaction. And so sometimes I go through and I'm like, am I seeing what I think I'm seeing? Am I sensing what I think I'm sensing about this interaction? And I just go through and find evidence. Like, okay, so do I think this person has good intentions? And you can trust your gut a little bit there too. So it's not to say that you have to go into everything completely blind to the fact that someone might not have good intentions, or
Oh
someone might be
man.
being a jerk or having a bad day or whatever it is.
Oh my gosh,
So,
you bring up such a good element to this conversation, Stephanie. I love how your brain works.
appreciate that. You as well.
So, but that's like a big thing too, because like in late identified life, one of the things that I noticed for myself, one of the biggest things that I notice across the board with all of the coaching clients that I work with, and it's that we have gotten to a place where we ignore or don't trust our gut because we've been told, in the past, because we will pick up on it early and we're like, oh no, that person is not, no. And we will tell other people, trying to protect them from this person that we have recognized does not have a good intent. And people are like, oh no, you can't. No, they're wonderful. They're so awesome. 6 months later, they're like, ooh, that person was really just like, they're horrible, blah, 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 blah.
Yes.
And nobody ever says, but you know what? I should have listened to you. You were right. No one ever tells you. But you're going, I told you, I was right. But then you doubt yourself that whole time because you're like, oh, everybody else seems to like them.
Right. Well, and I think that a lot of us pick up on patterns really fast. And so that you've seen something. And so if it's possible to slow down and kind of identify what it is, because these people might not be malicious human beings, but people can act in ways that are harmful and kind of destructive without even intending to. So if you're sensing a pattern and you're like, not even this is a bad person, but I sense this when I've seen this before, it meant this. When I've seen that kind of interaction of bad mouthing your friends to you constantly, it meant that this person's kind of trying to get control, or whatever it is that you can sense and fit into that pattern that feels so nice in the autistic brain. Like, you're just like, oh, it feels good to have a pattern recognized and to tell other people.
Like, I have a framework to operate from now.
Which I think is great. And
Me
so
too.
again, leveraging autistic strengths to support those areas where it might not be a strength in the world that we live in, I think is hugely important.
So I love that you said that, because I think that really kind of moves us into this next part that I really want to talk to you about. And it's, Stephanie, how do we leverage our autistic strengths in recognizing patterns and becoming aware of seeing sort of a consistency? What are some of the speech and language things that, in retrospect, as a late identified, neurodivergent human, how do we like look back and maybe start seeing a pattern that we may have some speech language challenges or barriers that maybe we have been navigating our life that we haven't quite noticed or been able to connect the dots to go, oh, this is an auditory processing delay. Oh, this is, a language, processing part that we have, or a processing delay in any type of speech language area. What are some of those, and how can we maybe start seeing that, using our autistic brains here put those patterns together. And how do we then seek help? What do we seek help for? What do we look for in a speech language therapist? You know, as an adult, what do we get access to? How do we access this? What do we do?
Two really great questions. Okay, so the first part, looking back on patterns and trying to identify where you might have some of those speech language communication needs. So I think I was trained as a scientist before I was an SLP. My brain loves that process. And I think it was not not just a coincidence that a lot of colleagues have autistic brains. They just do it. That pattern seeking and that liking to fit things in a box and some of that processing, I think, is helpful. And so I think being able to look back and say, okay, where do I find things difficult, uncomfortable? Where do I struggle? Where, in what situations am I kind of just missing something? It feels like I'm missing something. And then just kind of gather evidence. And so say, okay, is it when, you can also do it going forward rather than looking back in time. You can look forward, okay, do some hypothesis testing. I think I might have an auditory processing disorder. If that's the case, would writing things down help? And so kind of trying things out and seeing what works, I think is a good way to kind of consider, where might I be struggling, and trying to identify some of those things that resonate with you. Also reading and or listening to other autistic adult stories. People have done this work and have identified things that start. You've done a great job of highlighting some of these struggles. And I think when people hear that, like for me, listening to podcasts like yours, it's like, oh, that resonates with me. And so then I can go explore that and test those hypotheses. So that's a great question. And I think that's where I'd start, because there is no one size fits all kind of answer to this.
No. So what would be like some of the top areas of speech language that you tend to work most often with your autistic and ADHD clients? What are the things that come up most frequently? Like, is it auditory processing delay? What are those particular speech language things?
Auditory processing is a big area. And I think it's, like I said, tied into these other areas of attention, that monotropism that we sometimes have of like, I am attending to this and I really want to talk about this. So the auditory processing, and then the attention stream, I'm talking about this and I want to share this, that these aren't things I work on, but they are things that I think are really important to recognize, are like the modalities of communication for autistic people, of like, sometimes I just want to sit with you and just be in your presence, and that's how we're connecting, and it doesn't have to rely so much on speech and language, and it is valid and important. And sometimes I just really want to talk to you about my pet topic of the week. Like, I am a person who really has a hard time not sharing everything I know about topics that I'm passionate about. And
right there with you.
Right. It's never something I would ever, quote unquote, work on. But
jumping is my love language.
Yes, it is something to recognize and to appreciate, and also appreciate that not everyone can handle that right now. So that's okay.
Like I have gotten where I actually ask my partner now. It's like, I'm really excited and I've got like all these things sparking in my brain. And so I want to share them, and I need to get them out of my head and out of my mouth into the world in your brain. And I was like, I don't really even care if you listen, just kind of hold space for me.
Exactly.
Are you in a place to do that? And he'll go, I totally can't take it in right now. Or, and I'm like, okay. Or he'll go, okay, have at it. I'm listening. I can't wait. What do you want to share?
And what a great reframe. Like, I think it's important. It might be helpful to kind of say, here's what I don't do that most SLPs I think would work on. So here's what I don't work on. But I do think they're important things to recognize. That's one of them for sure. The other one is narrative storytelling. So which is so cultural. I really do consider this like a difference in culture, right? The autistic culture communicates very differently than the neurotypical culture. That doesn't mean we can't communicate with one another, but I think framing it that way, it's like, I would never work on it. I would never try to change someone's culture, but I think being aware of these cross-cultural differences is important, right? So in narrative storytelling, I am someone who, again, the processing speed is there. So you're bouncing around maybe, again, I have the ADHD overlaid on it. So I'm going off on a tangent and I'm like, I've got all these things going on. Hang with me here. And with the auditory processing piece, I asked my sister and other professionals who have different styles of communication, can you tell me the big picture first? Can you just give me that overview first so I can then focus on what you're saying? Because I can't follow your, even though that's how I talk, I can't follow your when it's bouncing around.
That is a huge one. I'm the same. I was like, I gotta have like the big framework, then all the little stuff makes sense to me. But none of the little stuff makes sense to me if I don't know, if I don't have the overview. If I don't have that 10,000 foot view,
Yes.
The 10-foot view makes no sense to me.
Can't.
I mean,
Can't
I
do
could
it.
see it. Sure, you could talk to me about it, but it's not assembling in my visual thinking.
No. And that's so important to know. And you can ask for that. Like the self-advocacy, I think is huge. And again, it does sound like you're putting a lot of onus on people, but I think if you think of it as that cultural difference of like, this is not how I do things, and I just need a little bit of support to it goes both ways, right? Like you can accommodate one another in a conversation, and that goes to, you know, we haven't even touched on like modalities in terms of support, multimodal communication, pictures, and we talked a little bit about the emojis, but I also
Hey,
do a lot of work with AAC.
I have mutism that shows up when I am really, really stressed. And especially
Absolutely.
if I will go into shutdown, you know, before I started doing all of the things that I do now. I mean, I'm in year 3.5, moving closer to year 4 of no shutdown, no burnout, no meltdown, which I didn't know was possible after 40 years
Yeah.
of on the chronic cycle burnout loop since age 6. And a lot of it had to do with unmet needs. And one of those was not recognizing my need for certain sensory profile needs, not
Absolutely.
recognizing my need of auditory processing delay, you know, noise canceling headphones, having captions makes a difference because my cognitive load was so huge from trying to focus and concentrate and process what somebody was saying. And then I also had, you know, because I have some other co-occurring health conditions, you know, and this is one of the areas that I study is vision therapy and vision science, my eye teaming and tracking, depending on my stress level and what was going on with particular health conditions, would change, and I wouldn't be able to read because I could not, my eye teaming was off. I couldn't track to read. So, you know, and then how does that then impact and influence all of these other things when you're talking about like cognitive load, right?
Yes. So fascinating. I mean, again, we can broaden it even more. I work with apraxia of speech. It's a huge deal. And knowing and being able to explore different modalities, whether you rely on AAC to communicate all the time or having it available, being able to text. I used to write down coffee orders because ordering food was very anxiety provoking. And just being able to say, like, you know what, why can't I just hand you a piece of paper and order something? Like, why is that a big deal? It's not. Look at that. Wow. So I think it does take a lot of work because services are really limited for adults. And I think a lot of professionals are not trained or not even aware that there would be a consideration for a lot of these things. So I think, you know, with my own therapist, I do a lot of just work with her. Like we're teaching each other, right? I'm saying, here's what works for me. And I finally have found someone who has a relationship where, you know, they're trusting what I say is real and not being like, well, autism, so no.
Right. So what are some things like, just, you know, from your side of things, like what are some things that you would suggest as sort of a framework or sort of some starting points for, you know, late identified autistic adult ADHD or who's listening today or watching today, and they're like, okay, I'm recognizing some of these things and I'm starting to connect the dots. How do I find an SLP and get some services, or what do I look for? How do I do this so that I'm getting somebody that's actually going to like connect and help me? And sort of like what you're describing here, find somebody that's working with you and gets it.
There are some great resources that are growing over time. The Therapist Neurodiversity Collective has a list, and there's other online resources that are compiling lists of therapists who are starting to get it, right? Like These are people who are committed to doing therapy of various kinds in the right way. And I think all of those are very important. An SLP has expertise, but there are other types of therapy that might be really helpful. And I think exploring what works for you is huge. And the autistic community, the autistic adult community, they love to share resources. So I found great lists of therapists, but it's not exhaustive because, like I said, a lot of people aren't even aware. Professionals are not even aware that this is something to consider. And I do think it really depends on the relationship you have with a professional, and if you can find someone who's open to it. So first of all, I would absolutely shut it down if you get a negative response, if you're disclosing that you're autistic, or if you're bringing up these concepts and you tend to, that is a place I would have a knee-jerk reaction. If I'm talking to a professional and they're like, well, I've worked with a lot of autistic people and I just don't think you're autistic, then I don't think that it's on the autistic person to teach that particular professional. I think that's going to be a longer road than you need to go down, and it is not. You know what I mean?
And here's the thing,
Not where you
you don't have to go with the first person you talk to just
Nope.
because you talk to them. You absolutely have the agency and the leadership and you're in authority in your own life to go, nope, you're not my person.
Yep.
And this is actually how I look at this. And I'll just share this for a sec before because I think you've got some great stuff, but just like from my experience here, my mom taught me this. So this was a really good one. My mom never sees any medical professional, any practitioner, anybody for anything, even her auto body stuff. She interviews them.
Yes.
And
that
she
is
will tell them,
phenomenal.
I'm interviewing you. I have not hired you yet.
Absolutely.
And if you don't meet my criteria, thanks for your time.
It is a service. And I understand completely that we won't get an insurance, or it would be hours and hours of insurance is awful. It can be a huge barrier. Cost is a huge barrier, but I hate to put it this way, it's better to have nothing than a bad therapist. I really firmly believe that. I've had some bad therapy myself and seen the effects of bad therapy on kids, adults, and it's hard. It's a hard line to walk. I think giving it that service, this is a service. And if you don't like that professional, don't stick with them at all. So that's thing one. But sometimes just because someone is ignorant of a topic or doesn't have the keyword that you are looking for, doesn't mean that they might, if they're willing to explore that with you. A lot of the best therapists I found didn't really know what they were doing or what to call what they were doing, but they had that good instinct of a lot of SLPs I've worked with, executive functioning coaches that I've worked with, even me. I think I was doing a lot of things with clients that were really great, but didn't know what to call it. And so if someone had come to me and said, I'm autistic and have an auditory processing disorder, I might not know off the bat that I could, that I could help with that. But my attitude was always, let's see what works for you. Let's go through and see if you have someone like that, that's worth a lot. Even if, and then they can refer you if they don't have the expertise, right? So then you can build those relationships and connections with professionals that will really, really help, I think.
Yeah, because the nice thing is, if you identify somebody that is open and curious and willing to, help from that perspective, not showing up like in their rightness, like I know everything, but in the curious and open, hey, let's figure out what works best for you. They are 9 times out of 10 still associated with other professionals that approach life and practice in the same way. So even if it doesn't fit into their zone of genius and they're like, hey, I would love to help you. This is out of my particular wheelhouse, but I have a colleague who this really falls in theirs and I'd love to refer you to them.
Yes.
9 times out of 10, it's going to be a good referral too. I have found.
Absolutely. And starting with the professional that clicks with you. So like there are occupational therapists, like I said, executive function, speech and language therapy, vision therapy is another huge area that's becoming really, the importance of these things is being recognized finally. And I think, if you find someone who you click with, I think that's really great. And for so many of us, I think we did a lot of the work ourselves, and I said that to my own therapist and to families that I work with. I can teach you and I can share my perspectives and I can work with you, but there might come a time when taking a break makes sense, and going off on your own and exploring and seeing what works for you. You know what I mean? Like I said, a lot of this isn't like rehabilitative therapy for a broken leg or something. It's not the same. It's not, there's no therapy that I'm really, as a speech language, even though we call it speech therapy, I do some of that, for things that need therapy, but a lot of it is exploring the accommodations and the strategies and the practicing the things that work for individuals. Like it's not anything, it's not magic. We're not magicians up here. So I think that professionals, like you said, it's a service, and these are people that can help, but make sure they're helping. They do not have like any wisdom beyond human capacity. So
and then that's one of the things too that I think we see a lot of, is that sometimes depending on where we live, depending on the access that we have to finding the services that we need, that we're starting to identify in late identified life, and some of those is too, it's sometimes we don't have the vocabulary, the vernacular to identify what the need is, or what the challenge is, even what those sensory profile things are. And guys, I'm really excited because part of my new book is How Spicy Is Your Burnout, coming out November the 4th. And it is triage for when you're hemorrhaging energy. Part of that, and part of the unveiling method, is going in, and I have a needs reflection form and I have a sensory profile form. And this is not from a deficit model, guys, because most things that are out there when we're talking about sensory profile comes from the deficit model. And I just want you to know that is just part of your neurology, as part of how you're wired. The sensory profile is natural. That is just the way we experience it. So the sensory profile that I created for us as neurodistinct humans looks at it and just says, hey, what is this for you? Because in burnout, your sensory profile is different than your thrive time. And also beautiful. Being able to, and being able to go through a needs reflection where it takes you through like 5 of the largest areas of need in your life, and helping you go, oh, okay, this need gets met. And by where the inverse of that, it's like, oh, well, this need is going unmet. That is the place to start, because it's those consistent unmet needs that lead to burnout and that chronic cycle burnout loop.
That is
so if you
fabulous.
So if you guys are looking for some help, that maybe you don't have access to something close to you, know that the unveiling method is online and accessible, and you can absolutely contact me. I have one-on-one coaching application available on resources.mindyourautisticbrain.com. Go take a look at it. Apply. Let's just figure out what resources you might need, because you know what? Stephanie may be your jam. She may be exactly what you need. So if you want to connect with Stephanie, Access Speech is the SLP clinic she and her sister run, and they have a nonprofit called Autism Included. And I'm going to make sure I have all of those things in the show notes. They are on LinkedIn, Facebook, and now Instagram. They're just starting to grow their Gram channel. So guys, make sure you go follow them and check them out under Autism Included. And I want to make sure that you know how you approach life, the way that you navigate life every day, be it with your headphones, be it with closed captions, be it with an aided device. If you need AAC sometimes, hey, I even put an app on my phone so that those times where I'm just like, my ears are tired and my mouth is just not connecting to my brain, I can use emojis and memes. And I just, text and connect, whatever makes it easy. So just know that there are lots of resources out there, and Stephanie is an amazing resource if you need some information or insight on anything SLP, or if you heard something today that connected with you and you're like, whoa, I have experienced this my whole life and I never knew this was what it was. Feel free to reach out to Steph. I'm sure she has some amazing insights and resources to share with you on those things. Please go check her out and support she and her sister and their amazing work they're doing in the world. Thanks so much for being here today, Stephanie. And guys, don't forget, you want to get on that pre-order list for How Spicy Is Your Burnout, coming November 4th.
I love it. Thank you so much.